Today is June 6th, 2019, 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. I'd like to honor the service and the sacrifice of Apex's greatest generation by telling you an Apex D-Day story. It's a story that Jean Sutton Hack told me a little over 10 years ago. If you are from Apex, I'm sure you know her, but if not, she lives. If you're new to Apex, she lives in that old house that was built in the late 1700s or perhaps the early 1800s on Highway 55 just south of downtown across from the Walmart. It's called the Rogers Sutton House. I'm going to tell you her story verbatim, the way she told it to me. It starts, as I said, about 5 years before D-Day. I was 12 years old, and I remember vividly. That morning we went to Sunday school and to church, and after church, a dear friend, Catherine Tudor of Fuquay, came home with me to eat lunch and to play. We had the radio on, a big wooden radio, a beautiful piece of furniture, and they broke in with the news of Pearl Harbor. My mother started crying. I asked her why. She said, Herbert, my only brother, who was 5 years older, he would be the perfect age to go to war. That was the first premonition I had of what was to come. My father was extremely upset too. He had been wounded in the First World War in France. At the time, Herbert was at Campbell College. In those days, you finished high school when you were about 16. Campbell was a junior college, and from there, he was going to go on to Carolina. Herbert was 19 when he was drafted and 20 when he was killed. He went to boot camp, came home for Christmas, then reported to Fort Meade, Maryland. From there, he was shipped overseas. He was a member of the Army's 2nd Infantry or Indian Head Division. He was not allowed to tell us where he was, but he wrote us letters. In one letter, he said, Daddy, you would like it here because they make good blackberry wine. He said that because Daddy made homemade wine. On August 3rd, 1944, Lloyd Castleberry, the police chief, came up to the house and asked where my daddy was. My mother was sitting on the front porch making a dress for me. She told him he was at the tobacco barn. Mr. Castleberry drove down there and then left. Then we saw Daddy coming to the house. Mama could tell something was wrong by the way Daddy was walking. His head was down, his shoulders were stooped, and he was crying. My mother, who never raised her voice, she started screaming, Alan, what is it? Is it Herbert? Is he all right? Is he wounded? Daddy couldn't speak. He just handed her the telegram, and they embraced and cried. The telegram was from President Roosevelt saying Herbert was killed in action on July 11th, 1944 in St. Lo, France. We had to send telegrams to all our relatives. Mama and Daddy were too torn up to go themselves down to the where they sent the telegraphs, so they sent me. I walked uptown and sent the telegrams, and by the time I got back home, the front yard was just full of cars and people. The people of Apex were so wonderful. Many months later, my mama decided to finish making me that dress. She was busy sewing when she heard the announcement on the radio that President Roosevelt had died. That would have been April 12th, 1945. My parents loved Franklin Roosevelt, so Mama was upset. Every time I work on this dress, she said, somebody dies. So that was the end of that dress. She never finished it. The Army never told us any details about his death. Years later, my mother advertised in a magazine called Stars and Stripes, requesting information. A man wrote us saying he recalled a soldier whom he believed to be my brother. He said that Herbert frequently volunteered to go out as a scout, and on one such mission, he was killed by a landmine. The man said that when a soldier is wounded, he is taught to signal his location by sticking his gun upright in the ground. When we found him, his gun was in the ground, but he had already died. Every year since 1945, our family has remembered Herbert by placing a red, white, and blue flower arrangement in the Apex Methodist Church, usually on the 4th of July weekend. Just before my mother died in 1966, she asked me to never stop doing this. A little postscript. After Miss Hack told me this story, I did a little research and then was able to share it with her. Thanks to the internet, I learned that even though her brother, Herbert, was not allowed to reveal his whereabouts to his family or anyone else, we now know that the history of the 2nd Infantry Division. In the months leading up to D-Day, Herbert would have trained in Wales or Northern Ireland, and with the rest of the 2nd Infantry, he would have crossed the English Channel on June 7th, the second day of the invasion. He landed on Omaha Beach near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. 3 days later, Herbert and his division liberated the city of Trevieres, Trevieres. They then began a long assault of Hill 192, a strategic German position on the road to St. Lo. The 2nd Infantry took the hill on July 11, 1944, the day Herbert died. From there, the Allies continued routing the Nazi army across northern France, Germany, and Czechoslovakia, culminating with the German surrender in May 1945. I have a picture of Herbert I want to show you. It's in our book. If you've got the book, on page 151, on the left side of the picture in the front row is Herbert Sutton, next to Bill Goodwin, a man who was a very big part of my life growing up. But there's Herbert Sutton on the far left. And this is his Boy Scout troop, the Apex Boy Scout troop. And you'll recall that he served as a scout, forward scout, surveying the advanced positions of the enemy in the military. So Apex had a contribution in his training even then. When I think back to Herbert Sutton and all the people from Apex who served in the war, and even specifically in the D-Day invasion, at least in the broad definition of D-Day, if you include all the weeks and months of fighting that followed to complete the invasion, I'm just amazed at how many served. I grew up on Hunter Street. Across the street was one of my best friends, Tim Donnelly. His father parachuted in the D-Day invasion. To the east of our house was Casey Helmold. Her father, Dick Helmold, was in the infantry in D-Day. And then to the south, behind us, was my friend Evan Edwards. These were all my age. And Evan's father, Everett, was a ball turret gunner who flew 20 missions over France and Czechoslovakia in the weeks and months following D-Day. I had an uncle who invaded in D-Day, and sometimes we know how horrible the death toll was in those first couple of days, but many also died in the weeks and months that followed, and that was the case of Herbert Sutton. Just a brief other story I'll share that relates to all this, and relates particularly to my family. There's kind of what I used to think of as a funny story, but now that I think about it, it's not so funny anymore. When my father returned home from the war, he had been in the Pacific Theater, and when he got home, there was no celebration at all. He said he didn't even get a hug. And that seems so cold to me, and it seems so typical of the Holleman family. They were not very emotional people. But my dad said, how can you celebrate? So many did not come home. And in fact, the farm next door was the Wumble farm. And the Wumbles, there was a boy who was about my father's age, his friend Miller Wumble. And he died in Europe in October in the wake of the D-Day invasion in Belgium. And in fact, his first cousin, who was also a family friend, same age, my father's friend, his name was Sam, he died one day after Miller died. So the Wumble family down in the New Hill area lost two sons. And so how do you celebrate when so many did not return home? I think there's another reason they didn't celebrate. They were very, or didn't talk about it with us. They were just modest people, and they believed they were just doing their duty. Well, we didn't grow up hearing their stories for those reasons. But I do think it's incumbent on us as the next generation to tell those stories so that their memories are preserved and their service and their sacrifice is honored. If you have a member of your family or someone you knew from the Apex area who served in the D-Day invasion or in any of the fighting in the weeks and months that followed, feel free to share that in the comments. I'll post this on Apex is Amazing and on YouTube.